Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 8 running back rankings for the 2022 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're covering all topics related to the running back position, beginning with waiver wire. Again, tonight, we have our waiver wires running, and I want to make sure that we're all up to date on the information in comparison to what I gave yesterday. Of course, we talked about Michael Carter. Now with the recent trade of James Robinson being the newest Jet running back, of course, we got to talk about the implications of that going forward and where the rest of the running backs kind of land in terms of my rankings going into our waiver wires running tonight. Then after that, we'll talk about matchups at the running back position in terms of how many points defenses have given up to opposing running backs thus far this season on average in a half PPR scoring format, meaning everyone in the middle, whether you do play in a standard league or a full PPR league, will give ourselves a little bit more of an indication as to who has the most advantageous matchups and what running backs perhaps we may want to be avoiding going into the week based on said matchups. After that, we'll then transition to our top 36 running back rankings, as I'll share with you guys statistics to justify the reasons as to how I see the position stacking up at the end of Week 8. Before we begin, of course, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2022 season in order to help you win not only your Week 8 matchups, but of course, a 2022 fantasy football championship. So do yourself a favor, click that subscribe button down below and help us get to our goal of 80,000 subscribers. Thank you very much. Also, for those of you who want to continue to play fantasy football, but outside of your leagues, potentially daily fantasy at your fingertips, check out PrizePicks. There's a link down in the description. When you travel to their website and use promo code Andrew today, when you make a first-time deposit, you'll be given a first-time deposit match up to $100. Again, whether it is playing the Thursday night contest or MLB playoffs, the NBA just recently began. You can go ahead, play daily fantasy there via PrizePicks. Check that out today. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into talking about the running back position, beginning with waiver wire. Again, yesterday we had Michael Carter as our number one, and on Yahoo, he was already rostered in 66% of leagues, but the primary reason why I wanted to, of course, mention him is because if, in fact, you were one of those, 34% of leagues where he was available, you wanted to go ahead and immediately address that by picking him up. Now that we have seen James Robinson traded to the New York Jets due to, of course, the Breece Hall season-ending ACL injury, there's going to be a little bit of a rotation there. I still believe that there is a very good chance that Michael Carter is going to be the primary guy, but it's not going to be as clean as we once thought. He'll most likely see far less touches than we anticipated, and with that, both these guys are RB3 options going forward until otherwise noted. As for who's going to be the number one waiver wire option at the running back position, that is firmly held by Gus Edwards. Even when I do expect to see J.K. Dobbins coming off of the injured reserve, I expect that Gus Edwards, the way that he looked on Sunday against the Cleveland Browns, is going to persist, and he'll continue to be the primary back of this team. So Gus Edwards, number one. Of course, we still haven't been given more information regarding Chuba Hubbard. We have heard that if he needed to have come back, he would have, which is very exciting. But again, we're not 100% certain as to what his status is. When we get to Wednesday, we'll know where his injury status is going into the week and whether or not he's going to even play/practice. But as of right now, both those guys, Chuba Hubbard and Dante Foreman, valuable prospects going into the week, along with Tyler Allgeier in the final week prior to the return of Cordero Patterson. That'll pretty much wrap it up in terms of waivers. Those are the guys in terms of priority that we're going after, and we'll continue on. All right, let's talk about matchups going into Week 8. As you can see immediately to the right of me, we have how many points defenses have given up to opposing running backs thus far this season on average in a half PPR scoring format, including all potential metrics that lead to positive fantasy points on screen. Of course, whether it is yards on the ground, touchdowns, receptions, targets, all of that encompassed in one singular graphic from weeks 1 through 7. Of course, taking into account that some of these teams have played 7 games while others have played 6, of course, in order to determine the averages as to how much they've given up to opposing running backs. But with all that taken into account, the research that I've done over the last couple years suggests that receiving totals do not really play a part in terms of the matchup upcoming. Therefore, the biggest difference maker as to whether a running back is getting themselves receptions and a high upside in said receptions is whether or not their team wants to target them in said format. So we go ahead and we isolate the rushing statistics going into Week 8, and we find that the Detroit Lions, Houston Texans, Cleveland Browns, Los Angeles Chargers, and the Bears still are amongst the top in terms of giving up the most fantasy points per week to opposing running backs. Of course, we see that the Cleveland Browns and the Detroit Lions, they are two of the worst teams, having giving up 10 touchdowns to opposing running backs on the ground thus far this season. The Detroit Lions doing that in just 6 games, and the Cleveland Browns in 7. Of course, those are ridiculous statistics, especially when we take that into account in comparison to teams like the Buffalo Bills, Tennessee Titans, Cincinnati Bengals, who have been extremely stout against the run. Some of the matchups that you typically don't want to have to play your running backs against, unless, of course, they have receiving upside that is absolutely going to give them an influx of fantasy points that they need. For example, the Buffalo Bills matchup, they're giving up about 3 yards per carry on average. They haven't really given up much on the ground, and with that being the case, the Green Bay Packers could struggle, but luckily, Aaron Jones has seen a recent influx in terms of his receptions, tying his career high of 9 receptions this last week. That may be able to even him out and get him in the right spot. But ultimately, when we're talking about rushing statistics isolated, this should represent the most advantageous and most difficult matchups going into the week and why we want to take advantage of it. Now, of course, we'll be referencing to these matchups as we progress throughout today's video, as I present a 1 through 5 star matchup rating. Of course, 5-star being the best possible matchup that you can have, while 1-star, which we typically don't really give out, would be a completely avoid this player matchup. But either way, let's go ahead and let's begin our top 36 running back rankings for week 8 of the 2022 fantasy football season, beginning with Derrick Henry. Derrick Henry is coming off another incredible week, 15 plus fantasy points. Of course, over the course of the last 4 games that he has played, he's been, the regular Derrick Henry that we know and love, getting himself a bunch of opportunity and delivering despite the fact that this Tennessee Titans offense has been extremely inefficient in terms of passing the ball. I don't know how they keep winning games, but they just keep doing so. And now they have an opportunity of taking on a division rival like the Houston Texans. In the last 3 games against the Houston Texans, Derrick Henry has averaged 37.83 fantasy points per game. I've legitimately never seen a statistic like this. In fact, just to kind of give you guys some isolated statistics, in the last 3 games he's played against the Houston Texans, he has had 88 rushing attempts, 673 rushing yards, 7 rushing touchdowns, and 113.5 fantasy points. It's a minimum of 2 rushing touchdowns and 200 yards in every single one of those games against Houston. So we're expecting a pretty big game here, of course, because most recently, the Houston Texans have allowed a 35-point running back this season, a 31.9-point running back, a 29.9-point running back, and a 25.5 points running back. Of course, most recently, we just saw Josh Jacobs have 143 rushing yards and 3 rushing touchdowns, all 3 rushing touchdowns in the second half against this defense. I'm expecting a lot from Derrick Henry as our number 1. Now, speaking of Josh Jacobs, let's transition to our number 2, taking on the New Orleans Saints. Now, in seasons past, I would be afraid of this matchup. But quite frankly, the New Orleans Saints have been awful in terms of stopping the run. Of course, the Cardinals this last week went for 106 rushing yards amongst their running backs for 2 rushing touchdowns. The Seahawks a couple weeks back, 142 and a touchdown. The Carolina Panthers with Christian McCaffrey, 133 rushing yards and no touchdown on the ground. And the Falcons, Cordero Patterson leading the way. But the Falcons running backs as a whole, 129 yards and a touchdown. The Saints have not been able to stop the run, and Josh Jacobs, for the last 3 consecutive weeks, has had a minimum of 140 rushing yards and a singular touchdown in every single one of his performances. Just to kind of give you some perspective as to what kind of status that is, just this last weekend's game against the Houston Texans, 140 yards and 3 rushing touchdowns, that is the first time a running back has done that since the year 2000. Curtis Martin of the New York Jets was the last running back to accomplish that feat. If you can just imagine, of course, Josh Jacobs is setting franchise records for the Raiders, and he's not stopping anytime soon, as they've won 2 out of the last 3 games, and quite frankly could have won all 3 of those games because of the efforts of Josh Jacobs. He continues to run the ball, continues to score a boatload of fantasy points. I'm expecting another big game here against the New Orleans Saints. Currently on Prize Picks, his more or less number in terms of rushing statistics is 83.5. I mean, he's putting up 140 each of the last 3 weeks. Why not take the more on that in an upcoming entry? Moving on to Saquon Barkley, taking on the Seattle Seahawks. Another one of these matchups that is extremely favorable for a running back of his status, coming off of another week of 100-plus rushing yards. Again, thus far this season, in the 7 games that he has played, 5 of those games have consisted of 100 or more yards total, whether it's rushing plus receiving. Now, in terms of a base minimum, Saquon Barkley has not put up less than 88 total yards in a singular game this season. So he's pretty much guaranteeing you 8.8 fantasy points with whatever receptions he gets. So probably 10 fantasy points flat in terms of how much he's going to get you. And then the touchdown upside is everything else. Now, luckily for him, he takes on the Seattle Seahawks. Over the course of weeks 3 through 7, the Seattle Seahawks have given up 20 plus points to 4 different running backs. I mean, just the ridiculous nature of that. 30.7, 20.4, 23.4, and 21.8. Unbelievable numbers that are obviously going to probably be going in the direction of Saquon Barkley this upcoming week. The running back that currently is the number 2 back in terms of yards before contact, number 2 running back in terms of yards after contact, number 2 running back in terms of rushing yards this season, and number 1 in terms of rushing attempts. And also, just to add on top of it, he's the number 2 running back in terms of rushes of 15 or more yards And if you may be wondering, who he's behind, why he's number 2 in all these categories, well, let's talk about our next running back. Number 4, Nick Chubb. Nick Chubb obviously is like the leader of majority of these statistics, and it's not really a surprise considering he has put up an unbelievable amount of fantasy points thus far this season, having himself another incredible performance against, quite frankly, one of the better run-stop defenses in the league against Baltimore last week, averaging 5.69 yards per carry. That was quite surprising to me. Now, he started off relatively slow, did find the end zone, but later on in the game found himself some burst runs, which we always find in regards to what Nick Chubb does at the end of a game. But either way, going up against the Cincinnati Bengals matchup is another tough one. The last 2 games that he's played against them, specifically in 2021, he put up 29.3 points and 6.5. Just to give you a little bit of perspective, that 6.5 point fantasy performance was in week 18, and they pulled Nick Chubb at halftime. So just to kind of go ahead, and yes, I want to give you all the information possible, but I also want to explain to you that 6.5 point performance is nothing to worry about. I'm expecting a huge performance out of Nick Chubb, and with all the trade rumors swirling around Kareem Hunt and the trade deadline being November 1st, we may be in line for another one of these trades where we see Nick Chubb have the backfield to himself. Of course, D'Ernest Johnson will be contributing, but as of late, 6 out of the last 7 games, Nick Chubb's been able to put up a total of 100 yards. I think he's in a perfect position to succeed. Why not go ahead, fire him up again? Let's go. Moving on to our number 5. It is Joe Mixon on the other side of that matchup on Halloween, October 31st. Joe Mixon will be, the nightmare for the Cleveland Browns defense, as the Cleveland Browns have been giving up over 20 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs in terms of rushing statistics alone. They have given up 10 plus fantasy points to 9 different running backs this season. Again, 9 different running backs, but they've only played 7 games. So, of course, they've given up their fair share of points, giving up a league high tied with the Detroit Lions of 10 rushing touchdowns to opposing running backs, which quite frankly is where Joe Mixon has, as of late, suffered. Due to the fact that thus far this season, he has 9 red zone rushing attempts inside the 5-yard line, but only 1 rushing touchdown, we have seen him get stuffed multiple times. He honestly should have a minimum of 5 rushing touchdowns this year if this offensive line blocked well and or Joe Mixon figured it out. Now, luckily this last week, he found the end zone on the goal line, but it is super upsetting to continue to see this man suffer at the goal line. But luckily, at least he's been able to recover those fantasy points that he's been missing out in terms of his receiving yards. As of thus far, the pace that he holds for 2022 should lead him to 87 total targets, 66 catches, 442 receiving yards, and a minimum of 2 receiving touchdowns at the end of the season. That will be career highs in all of those numbers. And in my opinion, as long as those numbers for the goal line continue to increase and open themselves up, Joe Mixon is a perfect play against the Cleveland Browns. Let's talk about Kenneth Walker III. Kenneth Walker honestly deserves to be in this conversation because what he has been able to accomplish in the last couple weeks is unbelievable. Again, coming off of 168 rushing yards this last week, 2 rushing touchdowns. Of course, we expected success, specifically against the Los Angeles Chargers, who are giving up over 6 yards per carry thus far this season on average. But now we get into a conversation about taking on the New York Giants. And quite frankly, in the last couple weeks, we've seen the New York Giants suffer against running backs. Kenyon Drake, 10 carries, 119 rushing yards. Travis Etienne, 14 carries, 114 rushing yards. A lot of potential can be had here, especially behind this offensive line and this blocking scheme for Seattle, who has opened up massive holes for Kenneth Walker. Specifically, thus far this season, yards before contact per attempt. As of right now, Kenneth Walker is amongst the highest in the National Football League with a 4.82 yard average. That is unbelievable statistics. As of thus far, he's also number 3 amongst all running backs in yards per carry at a 6.13 yard per carry average, only behind Khalil Herbert and, of course, DeAndre Swift. We're in a situation where, of course, we expect to see Pete Carroll want to continue to run the ball. And if they continue to succeed in the running game, they're not going to stop anytime soon. Moving on. Let's talk about Christian McCaffrey. Man, we got the nice, spicy jersey ready for y'all for the San Francisco 49ers running back. As of right now, the fact that he played 22 offensive snaps and still managed to get 10 total touches leads me to believe that they are going to funnel attempts into his hands. Now, of course, whether he gets a huge influx of receptions, that is a completely different conversation, but at least we have a couple baseline ideas as to what we can expect this week. They take on the Los Angeles Rams. The 49ers have beaten the LA Rams in 7 consecutive regular season games. I'm expecting this to be a win for the 49ers once again here. Now, a couple things that I wanted to mention. Earlier this year, in week 6, Christian McCaffrey had the privilege of taking on the Rams as a member of the Carolina Panthers. He put up 19.3 fantasy points against that defense, 13 carries for 69 rushing yards, had himself 7 catches for 89 yards. An incredible game, even without a touchdown overall. So if we're going to go ahead and talk about the potential of Christian McCaffrey, I'm expecting him to be the league back. Of course, nobody else is going to touch the ball even remotely close to the amount that he will this upcoming week, as he'll have a full spectrum of the backfield within his mind, he'll have learned it by the time we get to next Sunday. And when he does, against the LA Rams run stop defense, sure, they have been pretty good this season, but they somehow, some way always struggle against Christian McCaffrey, whether it was back in 2020 or earlier this year. Christian McCaffrey has their number. And of course, the 49ers do as well. Kyle Juszczyk had surgery on his finger earlier this week. Juszczyk, since week 3, has been able to accumulate 12 targets, 11 catches, 153 rushing yards. That's about 15.3 fantasy points in the last couple games here, just off of receiving statistics alone towards Juszczyk. With him not available, of course, Christian McCaffrey will be picking up that receiving work. Moving on, let's talk about Alvin Kamara. Even though many of you are worried about Alvin Kamara, you have to understand that despite the fact that he has not been scoring touchdowns, he has still been an extremely relevant fantasy prospect considering his receiving upside. Andy Dalton looks like Drew Brees out there. Not in the idea of being able to throw for touchdowns or, all this other, metrics. I'm just talking about purely targeting Alvin Kamara. Because quite frankly, since 2020, we haven't seen a quarterback target Alvin Kamara at this capacity. In the last 3 weeks, we have seen 24 targets and 19 receptions from Alvin Kamara due to the efforts of Andy Dalton. And if we continue to see that go in the direction, of course, that's a 26.7 half PPR fantasy point influx, which of course, many running backs don't really see. And if, in fact, we're going to continue to see Alvin Kamara utilized in this capacity, I know Dennis Allen, the head coach of the Saints, did not want to name a starter on Monday. But if we're going to continue to see Andy Dalton be the starter of this team, I'm expecting a minimum of 6 receptions per game, similar to the way that we've seen it over the course of the last 3 games. Most recently, we've seen the Las Vegas Raiders give up their fair share of yards to, of course, Dameon Pierce this last week. 92 rushing yards on 20 carries, 4 targets, 4 receptions, 25 yards, no touchdowns. But ultimately, there's a lot of potential here. The only thing really stopping Alvin Kamara is Taysom Hill, who has 4 touchdowns inside the 10-yard line, whether it's rushing or receiving this season, which obviously doesn't help, but the receiving yards, that kind of gets it a little bit even at the end of the day. Moving on, let's talk about Travis Etienne, the thumbnail for today's video. Travis Etienne is now the full-time back due to the trade that, of course, saw James Robinson leave the Jacksonville Jaguars backfield, which really wasn't much of a surprise considering James Robinson quite literally had 0 rushing attempts in Week 7. Now, when we go ahead and we just look at Travis Etienne and what he's been capable of doing, there's a reason why I mentioned him as a must-trade target in Thursday's video of last week, because we knew that the breakout was eventually going to be upon us, and we saw that exactly. In the last 3 games, weeks 5 through 7, Travis Etienne's been averaging 7.97 yards per carry on average. That is an unbelievable, ridiculous statistic. Now, going into this upcoming week, when you take on the Denver Broncos defense, of course, they have played relatively well, but Travis Etienne is going to get it done on the ground or through the air. It doesn't matter. Quite frankly, his 18.4 fantasy points from last week should have been far more, as he had a 17-yard rush towards the end zone, and the ball popped out and went into the end zone and was a touchback. He could have very easily had himself another 7.7 fantasy point influx based on that rush, but who knows? Perhaps he was going to be tackled at the 1-yard line, but either way, the rushing attempt was there. For those of you who saw my tweet, I was in absolute agony watching that kind of an attempt and rushing touchdown potentially tacked off his overall, production. Either way, over the course of the last 3 weeks, averaging about 10, 11 carries per week, yet still averaging about 90 rushing yards per game. Pretty ridiculous statistics for the RB1 for the Jacksonville Jaguars. Moving on to Jonathan Taylor. Now, the expectation for the Indianapolis Colts going forward without Matt Ryan under center is that they're not going to throw the ball 50 times a game anymore. With Sam Ehlinger as the starting quarterback, I expect them to get back to running the ball 15 to 25 times per game. And if we're going to get to that position, specifically with Jonathan Taylor getting those isolated rushing attempts, of course, he'll get back to being the Jonathan Taylor of old. I do want to remind you guys, I know he has started slow this year, and of course, the ankle injury held him out for 2 separate games, but just go ahead and go back to last season, 2021. Travel back with me. In 2021, weeks 1 through 4, Jonathan Taylor was only averaging 11.75 fantasy points per game throughout the first 4 games of his season. And then eventually had the breakout game, and it was all she wrote. I mean, he ran away with the entire RB1 category and finishes the RB1 at the end of the year. I'm expecting to continue to see this kind of eventual breakout take place. Even though weeks 1 through 4 of last year, he put up 47 fantasy points. In the first 5 games of this year, 57.7 fantasy points. We're in that close range, and I'm purely expecting that when, in fact, that breakout happens, specifically this week, Jonathan Taylor will be back to his normal self. Moving on to Rhamondre Stevenson. After last night's game, there was an expectation versus reality in my mind, and I purely did not expect that the running game was going to shrivel up as much as it did for the New England Patriots offense. Yet, it doesn't really matter because Rhamondre Stevenson saved this week with 8 targets, 8 catches, 59 receiving yards, and quite frankly, has pretty much solidified himself as the RB1 of this team. And we may not see much of Dameon Harris for the rest of the way. Now, of course, I'm hoping that Dameon Harris gets some opportunities because he's a talented running back. But quite frankly, 3 rushing attempts for 8 rushing yards, 2 targets, 1 catch last night for 1.5 fantasy points, having only played 9 snaps on Monday. I don't know if that was a matter of injury or if that was a matter of game script or a matter of just preference from the organization. Because quite frankly, if they're expecting and they feel the confidence that Rhamondre should be the first and second down back, then he's going to dominate all 3 downs regardless of game script. If they're up 40 points, sure, they'll maybe hand off a couple more balls to Dameon Harris. But if they're down 30, they're going to, of course, throw the ball a bunch. If they're in a neutral game script, they're going to go ahead and run it with Rhamondre Stevenson. As of the last couple weeks here, weeks 3 through 7, Rhamondre Stevenson is the number 3 overall running back in terms of total fantasy points put forward. And I think as long as he continues to be the main guy within this offense, there's a lot of value to be had as a New England Patriots running back, as this offense, passing-wise, is in a little bit of flux. Moving on to the final RB1 on today's episode, we have Leonard Fournette taking on the Baltimore Ravens on Thursday night. Leonard Fournette purely needs receptions. If Leonard Fournette is not going to catch the ball 6 to 7 times in a singular game, we are going to have another unfortunate performance against the Baltimore Ravens. And I'll tell you exactly why. Because the Carolina Panthers game was supposed to be get right. And somehow at the end of the week, we were asking ourselves, how did this go so wrong? And going forward, if we're not going to see him continue his streak, because he had a 4-game streak of 5+ receptions, and those games were absolutely separating himself from the pack, because in 3 of those games, he had scored a receiving touchdown within the red zone. So if we're not going to see those numbers continue to increase, especially with Julio Jones down with an injury, Russell Gage down with an injury, Mike Evans dealing with a little bit of an ankle, Cameron Brate still out. If we're not going to see his total reception numbers go up, of course, the running game hasn't been great for this offense, and quite frankly, is not going to improve just on a short week against the Baltimore Ravens. That's why we have him at number 12. All right, let's go ahead. Let's review visually our top 12 running back options for Week 8 of the 2022 fantasy football season, giving you guys some perspective as to what I think the position is going to look like by the end of the week. Again, if you would like to join us Sunday morning, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, I will have updated rankings there. That is why I always mention that rankings are subject to change as we progress throughout the week, as injuries take place, and as different information is revealed to us, whether it is offensively or defensively. Rankings are going to change, and when they do, you have to go ahead and join us Sunday morning to get your lineup set. Kick off with Kirchhoff with updated rankings Sunday morning at every single primary position, including kickers and defenses. So join us then. Thank you very much. All right, beginning the RB2 conversation, let's begin with Dalvin Cook. Dalvin Cook's one of the best running backs in the league. We know this. And going into this week off of the bye week, I'm expecting to see a lot of success, especially considering the last couple games from weeks 3 through 6, his averages have looked like the Dalvin Cook of old, averaging 17 rushing attempts per game, 86 rushing yards per game, a 5.04 yard per carry average, 1 rushing touchdown per game, 15.77 fantasy points per game. Obviously, his receiving totals have not been great, and that mainly has to do with O'Connell's offense, looking similar to what Sean McVay has done over the last couple years in regards to not being able to target the running back position and primarily just using running backs as rushing threats. Luckily, this upcoming week, they take on the Arizona Cardinals. There is a conversation to be had here that the Arizona Cardinals are one of the better defenses in the league. Obviously, their secondary did not play well against Andy Dalton, but in terms of stopping the run, they have been one of the better teams over the course of the season. That all being said, I think there's a very good chance that Dalvin Cook off the bye week, fresh, ready to go, they've got a game plan ready to run the ball down their throats. And when they do so, we're going to find ourselves a lot of fantasy success. The last thing I wanted to mention is in regards to prize picks. Again, when we're talking about fantasy potential of Dalvin Cook, his current number is 80.5 rushing yards. Unfortunately, he has only been able to surpass that total in 3 out of the last 6 games, of course, making it a little bit of a 50-50 here. But I think there's a very good chance for him to surpass that number going into this upcoming weekend. Moving on, let's talk about Raheem Mostert, one of the easiest matchup, in fact, the easiest matchup in terms of rushing statistics allowed at the running back position, giving up 22.98 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs in just 6 games thus far this season. They have allowed 9 running backs to produce 10 plus fantasy points against the Detroit Lions defense from weeks 1 through 7. Unbelievable statistics. And luckily for Raheem Mostert, since taking the starting job in week 4, he's been able to completely take over and put together an incredible influx of fantasy points, averaging 13 fantasy points per game with about 15.75 attempts per game, 77.5 rushing yards per game, 0.5 touchdowns per game, and quite honestly, getting himself receptions. Just last week, 5 targets, 4 catches, 30 yards, and a receiving touchdown. When Chase Edmonds can't even get himself the receiving work, we know this backfield is ultimately just Raheem Mostert's through and through. And if that's going to continue to be the case, especially against Detroit, I'm expecting probably a better game than number 14. He may honestly be a top 5 running back by the end of the week, but we got to play it safe with Raheem Mostert. Moving on to Dameon Pierce, our number 15. Dameon Pierce, amongst all running backs is seeing one of the most unbelievable statistics in terms of opportunity at the running back position. That's one of the most important variables in terms of leading to success in fantasy football. The more opportunities you have to touch the ball, the more chance you have of scoring more fantasy points. I think that's a pretty understandable, equation that we could put forth. But going into this upcoming week, the fact that we have seen Dameon Pierce from weeks 3 through 7 average 24.25 opportunities per game. About 20 rushing attempts per game on average, getting himself about 4.25 targets per game. Over the last couple weeks, has seen himself a huge influx of receptions, 13 receptions in the last 3 games. If those numbers continue to be in that direction, and if we're, of course, seeing Dameon Pierce potentially find the end zone this upcoming week against Tennessee, his fantasy point production is far past the number 15 rank, as he's been the number 2 overall running back in missed tackles forced, 38 of them total, and the number 1 running back thus far this season in broken tackles with 16 of them. I think he's in a perfect position to succeed. Of course, the Tennessee Titans defense, they're tough, but if you continue to give him the ball, he's going to hammer in some points there. Moving on to Aaron Jones. Even though Aaron Jones was expected to have touchdowns, I mentioned it on last Thursday's video in terms of trade targets going after Aaron Jones. I told you guys that he was going to get 8 touchdowns in the next 8 to 10 games. And you know what? He went ahead and scored himself 2 receiving touchdowns in this last weekend's game against Washington. He played 74% of the offensive snaps, and what it looks like to me is that A.J. Dillon is pretty much gone, because A.J. Dillon played 16 snaps in comparison to Aaron Jones, who played 40. If we're going to continue to see Aaron Jones be the primary back, whether it's on the ground or through the air, specifically setting a regular season career high of 9 total receptions, if those numbers are going to be anywhere in that range, by all means, he's going to have himself a great week, especially against the Buffalo Bills, who have been only giving up 3.07 yards per carry on average. He's going to need to receive the ball out of this backfield. And if he doesn't, we may be in a little bit of trouble behind this Green Bay offensive line. Moving on to our number 17, we have Miles Sanders taking on the Pittsburgh Steelers defense. This is the fight for Pennsylvania, pretty much. Both these organizations, of course, like to run the ball, but I think the Philadelphia Eagles just do it that much more efficiently. Now, thus far this season, the contributions of Miles Sanders have led to him to averaging 17.5 rushing attempts per game, 80.8 rushing yards per game, a 4.61 yard per carry average, and 0.67 rushing touchdowns per game. Overall, 13.7 fantasy points per game on average, which quite frankly is an incredible number considering the fact that Miles Sanders didn't even score a single touchdown last season and was dealing with a lot of injuries. But going into this year, the fact that he's been able to get those touchdowns, having himself 4 rushing touchdowns from inside the 10-yard line, those are great numbers. But unfortunately, inside the 5-yard line, there have been many of opportunities stolen from Miles Sanders. He could be a top 3 running back at this moment if it wasn't for Jalen Hurts taking 10 rushing attempts inside the 5-yard line for 5 rushing touchdowns. That influx of points would be incredible. But either way, they take on the Pittsburgh Steelers. I'm expecting behind one of the best offensive lines in the league to find success. As we've recently seen this season, Raheem Mostert go for 18.9 fantasy points, Leonard Fournette 19.1, Breece Hall 14.8, Nick Chubb 17.3, and Dameon Harris 15.7. Overall, if the fantasy points are flowing towards running backs against the Pittsburgh Steelers, I'm expecting Miles Sanders to join that group. Moving on, DeAndre Swift's our number 18. He was surprisingly not active last week. Now, of course, we knew this on Saturday night, and we prepare for it for Sunday morning. And obviously, Jamaal Williams had the fumble on the 1-yard line just to ruin our overall weeks. But the fact that he has spent 4 weeks on the injured, he's not even on the injured reserve. The fact that he's just missed 4 weeks and not been on an injured reserve stint is surprising to me. Hopefully, when he comes back, he's not going to be limited in any capacity. Hopefully, the 4 weeks that he's taken off is going to give him enough health, whether it's shoulder or ankle-wise, to just be an immediate guy that's going to get the ball 20 times in the singular game. Because from weeks 1 through 2, when he was averaging 10 yards per carry, those were the numbers that were going to save our season. But we need him to get back and bring life to this offense. They need a spark. They're one of the worst teams in the league. Chark's out on the IR. Reynolds doesn't look healthy. St. Brown's, been missing because of his own respective injuries. And I really do think that the Miami Dolphins matchup is a favorable enough one that if DeAndre Swift is active this week, he should have himself a pop-off performance. Of course, we've recently seen Dalvin Cook find the end zone, Breece Hall find the end zone, Michael Carter with 2 touchdowns as well. Mixon found the end zone against this defense. And even though Najee Harris was only able to put up 65 rushing yards, at least that's good for Najee Harris' sake. All we need to see is DeAndre Swift come back at a full capacity, and he's a fantastic option for this week. Moving on to Ezekiel Elliott, our number 19. I told you guys he's going to score touchdowns. On Thursday of last week, I told you guys to potentially trade for Ezekiel Elliott. Now, it mainly had to do with the fact that he had an incredible matchup against the Detroit Lions. And this last week, he did end up getting outsnapped for the first time this season by Tony Pollard. This may be a potential sell high position, but I will go ahead and give you a little bit of information in regards to why we might want to just continue to hold on to him. He scored 2 touchdowns on Sunday, sure. but he also had 4 rushing attempts inside the 5-yard line. They wanted to make sure that he was the goal line back, and they established that, in my opinion. Now they take on the Chicago Bears, a 5-star matchup going into the week, having given up, 16.34 fantasy points per game on average thus far this season in terms of rushing stats to opposing running backs. Those are the numbers that we want to see, especially considering the fact that just last night, Rhamondre Stevenson and Dameon Harris did not find much success on the ground. I'm expecting that the Dallas Cowboys, of course, continue to commit to the running game, whether it is with Tony Pollard and or Zeke, and find success. Both these guys are going to be in my top 24 rankings. As long as Zeke continues to be the goal line back and dominate in terms of the wide majority of rushing attempts going in his direction, I don't care how many snaps he plays. As long as he's on the field and getting opportunities, he's the primary back for this team and has a lot of value considering this offense will be scoring a lot of points in the coming weeks. Moving on to our number 20, we have Gus Edwards. Gus the Bus had an incredible debut for 2022 with 18.6 fantasy points, 2 rushing touchdowns. Quite frankly, having himself 2 rushing touchdowns was a surprise in my eyes. I honestly thought we were going to see a running back by committee situation as they eased him in, but there was nothing of the sort. They immediately established by having him play 23 snaps and giving him 17 total opportunities that he was going to be the number 1 going forward. And he established that, and we're good to go with that. Now, this last week, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, they struggled heavily, only putting up 3 offensive points. And if they're going to do something very similar on Thursday night, where they're not even able to stop the run, and we're going to see another big performance out of a running back, specifically off the tails of Dante Foreman putting up 118 rushing yards, and of course Chubb Hubbard going over 60 rushing yards. That duo combined for 24 rushing attempts, 181 rushing yards, a rushing touchdown, 4 catches for 37 receiving yards. If we're going to see similar numbers in any sort of capacity on the ground, of course, Gus Edwards will be getting wide majority of those opportunities going in his direction, and he will be able to deliver for our fantasy teams. The crazy stat that I wanted to mention was the last time the Tampa Bay Buccaneers gave up 100 rushing yards to a singular running back prior to Foreman of this last week was week 7 of 2021 against Khalil Herbert. It had been quite some time as this team has been pretty good in terms of stopping the run, but as of late, really the offense is struggling, and because of that, the defense can't get off the field as they're continuously playing for majority of games. Moving on, let's talk about David Montgomery. David Montgomery was incredible. The fact that he somehow, some way put up the fantasy points that he did, I will take it. Especially against Bill Belichick's defense. Going against the Dallas Cowboys this week is going to be a struggle, but what I do want to mention to kind of give you guys some semblance of confidence is the fact that Khalil Herbert, even though at the end of the night, finished with 12 rushing attempts, had himself, a good yardage count, had himself a receiving touchdown. Despite the fact that he was great, Herbert did not see his first rushing attempt until there was 5 minutes and 33 seconds left in the second quarter. The reason why Khalil Herbert was given rushing attempts was a matter of game script. This entire team ran the ball against the New England Patriots and found success. In fact, Justin Fields led the team in rushing attempts, 14 attempts for 81 yards and a rushing touchdown. But as of right now, Khalil Herbert seems to be the number 3 rushing opportunity or option within this backfield. So I'm not worried about him digging too much into David Montgomery's overall workload. It was a matter of game script that led to them splitting touches as everyone was succeeding against this defense. And as that being the case, David Montgomery this upcoming week should see an influx of receptions. The numbers in terms of rushing attempts should continue to be there. And luckily, they gave him one of the lone rushing attempts of the weekend because the prior week against the Washington Commanders, both Khalil Herbert and Justin Fields failed their opportunities inside the 5-yard line. Luckily, they got Montgomery back on the goal line and scoring touchdowns. Moving on to Eno Benjamin. Now, I have Eno Benjamin here under the assumption, of course, that we do not see James Conner return. Now, if James Conner returns, we're going to see probably split touches within this backfield, as Eno Benjamin has earned himself enough opportunity to at least guarantee some sort of a rotation, similar to the way that Chase Edmonds and James Conner produced early on in the 2021 year. So we're going to see Eno Benjamin be the receiving back, the 2-minute drill back, the change of pace back, potentially down in the red zone. Of course, he's going to have value. If James Conner is to miss another consecutive week here, the Minnesota Vikings matchup is far too favorable for a singular Arizona Cardinals running back to not play them within our top 24. Moving on, we have Devin Singletary, who, quite frankly, in the last couple weeks has been one of the best running backs in fantasy football. Since week 3, his fantasy point contributions have led to RB finishes of RB6, RB22, RB47, and RB15. So pretty much he has been 3 out of the last 4 games that he has played in RB2 or better in fantasy football half PPR. Mainly because, as of late, the influx of targets has been unbelievable. 5.75 targets per game on average, leading to 4.5 receptions per game, 37.75 receiving yards per game. We purely anticipated Cook, the rookie running back out of Georgia, to be the receiver out of this backfield, but considering it has been Devin Singletary since week 3, 23 total targets, 18 receptions. Those numbers account for a lot more than just, receptions. They're pretty much the influx of points that he needs to combat the fact that he's not getting any rushing touchdowns, as when they get down there, Josh Allen's a rushing threat, and quite frankly, they're throwing for majority of games and throwing a lot of touchdowns, which doesn't really lead them down to the 5-yard line for red zone goal line attempts. This all being said, we have purely seen that the Buffalo Bills are not afraid of running the ball, especially against teams that cannot stop the run, specifically the Kansas City Chiefs. So when they take on the Packers this week, I'm expecting them to join a lot of these other teams who have just rammed the ball down their throat. Washington against Green Bay had 31 rushing attempts for 136 rushing yards. The New York Jets had 26 rushing attempts for 157. The New England Patriots had 32 rushing attempts for 152. I'm expecting Devin Singletary, similar to week 6 against the Kansas City Chiefs, to have himself a lot of running opportunity and, of course, include some receptions in his direction. Moving on to Tony Pollard to close out our RB2 conversation. With Tony Pollard finally getting more snaps than Zeke, and obviously getting more receiving work than Zeke, it has pretty much established itself as a potential RB2 going forward, because what he does in between the 20s, regardless of whether or not he gets a rushing touchdown, I mean, he's always got the ability to break off a 30-yard run for a touchdown, but what he does in between the 20s is so valuable for this offense that they're not getting rid of him. They're going to give him more touches, and with that, he's going to have that much more fantasy upside. As of thus far this season, yards after contact, he's averaging per attempt 4.34 yards. That is an unbelievable number. That's number 2 amongst all running backs, only behind DeAndre Swift thus far this season in terms of running backs with 20 or more rushing attempts this year. As we will continue to see Tony Pollard be a vital part of this offense, averaging 5.6 yards per carry. I know he had 1 rushing attempt inside the 5-yard line. It led to a no gain, but the fact that it was there leads me to believe that maybe they'll split some carries down in the red zone, and when they do, Tony Pollard will be an incredible option in a given week. All right, let's go ahead and show you guys a visual representation of our RB2 conversation, our 13 through 24. Again, if you want to stay up to date on my latest rankings, you can go ahead and check out our Patreon. Other than that, you can go ahead and join us Sunday morning, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. We live stream every Sunday with updated rankings on screen for a half PPR scoring format in order to give you guys the best possible chance of winning your Week 8 matchups. All right, now that we've covered the RB2 conversation, let's move on to our RB3s. Let's begin with Najee Harris. Again, Najee Harris continues to be an RB3 in my eyes because his production hasn't been great. But as of late, there's been a little bit momentum for Najee Harris. He took the plate that was in his shoe, pretty much there to prevent that Liz Frank injury that he sustained this offseason from progressing to something worse. He took that out of his shoe and quite frankly had one of the better games of his season. This was the second game in which he was given 20 touches. As long as we start trending in that direction, we're going to find success. He takes on the Philadelphia Eagles. When teams have been able to play close with the Eagles as of late, whether it was Dallas or the Arizona Cardinals, rushing success has been found. Arizona, 17 carries, 80 yards and a touchdown. Dallas, 24 carries, 125 and a touchdown. If you can keep it close with Philly, of course, the game script will lead to Najee Harris running the ball and finding success, hopefully, this upcoming week. Moving on to number 26, Brian Robinson. Even though Brian Robinson has been a very inefficient running back in terms of only averaging 3.37 yards per carry, they continue to give him the rock. 20 rushing attempts this last week. The week before that had 17 rushing attempts. He even had himself a couple sprinkles of receptions this last week. But going forward, my biggest concern is the 1.7 yard average of yards before contact per attempt. That in itself is unbelievably unfortunate, because some other running backs, like, Kenneth Walker, is averaging over 4 yards in that category. So it's a matter of this offensive line being able to block up front and be far more successful in that opportunity, because if they're not, Brian Robinson is going to continue to be an inefficient running back, and we may see more touches go in the direction of Antonio Gibson if his efficiency is not going to be there. Antonio Gibson had himself 10 rushing attempts this last week. That could be a concern going forward, but at least they're taking on Indianapolis, who most recently gave up 132 rushing yards to running backs, and against the Jacksonville Jaguars, they gave up 197 rushing yards. Pretty good production, potentially coming forth with Brian Robinson this week. Moving on to Tyler Allgeier. They take on the Carolina Panthers, one of the easiest matchups of the week. The fact that this team, regardless of what the score is, whether they're down 21 or whether they're down 17, it doesn't matter. They're going to only run the ball. Thus far this season, they have a 60% rushing rate when we go ahead and combine quarterback rushing attempts along with running back rushing attempts. If we just go ahead and look at running back rushing attempts in comparison to passing total, they have about 181 rushing attempts amongst running backs and 150 passing attempts from the quarterback position. It's a 55% rate from the running back position. And with Cordero Patterson out probably one more week here, Allgeier sets himself up for success, potentially finding the end zone in double-digit fantasy points. Moving on to Darrell Henderson. Darrell Henderson, when given ample opportunity, is a fantastic running back option. Going back to 2020, in the games that he was given 15 or more touches in a game, he's averaged 14.32 fantasy points per game. Now, in those games, he didn't have to play the 49ers every single week, but this upcoming week has the privilege of doing so. It's one of the tougher matchups, and quite frankly, the fact that the 49ers have beaten the Rams in 7 consecutive regular season matchups concerns me, because if in fact the game script gets away from the LA Rams, the touches that we're going to see go in the direction of Darrell Henderson won't be as, fruitful. And if not, they're not going to be there, and we're going to have to rely upon a touchdown. It's going to be difficult. Luckily, the last time we saw him out, he did find the end zone and did get about 12 fantasy points, but ultimately, it's a matter of getting him consistent touches in the running game early on to be able to keep this defense off the field and keep these drives alive instead of 3 out and punt. Moving on, 29, we have D'Onta Foreman taking on the Atlanta Falcons. If in fact we do see Chuba Hubbard miss any sort of time, of course, D'Onta Foreman is going to be of value. But I do want to mention that Chuba Hubbard dominated the rushing attempts prior to the fourth quarter. In the fourth quarter, D'Onta Foreman had himself 11 rushing attempts for 54 yards. Prior to the fourth quarter, he did have himself some, overall utilization, and quite honestly was efficient, as he had himself 4 rushing attempts for 64 rushing yards, and on top of it had himself 2 catches for 27 receiving yards. So even with minimal opportunity, he broke off a huge 60-yard run. Great overall breakout there, but ultimately it's a matter of whether Chuba Hubbard is available. If in fact he is, I'm expecting Chuba Hubbard to probably be in this number 29 position against the Atlanta Falcons, which will of course diminish his value. Moving on to our number 30, Antonio Gibson. Like I was mentioning earlier, if Antonio Gibson is going to continue to see utilization, 10 attempts for 59 yards, a 5.9 yard per carry average last week, and also saw himself an end zone touchdown last week. If we're going to continue to see this kind of utilization from him, whether it's on the ground, through the air, splitting it with Brian Robinson, of course, we're going to be in a fantastic position. The fact that he played 29 total snaps and had 14 total opportunities, 50% of the time, if you're going to go in and get an opportunity, that is beautiful for me. I think this is going to be a perfect mixture of enough running from Brian Robinson and enough of a change of pace from Antonio Gibson to keep both these running backs active and in a position to succeed. Of course, with Taylor Heinicke at quarterback, they're far less willing to go ahead and not run the ball. So if they're going to continue to run, Antonio Gibson is going to be a huge part of this offense. Moving on to Jamaal Williams. Unfortunately, Jamaal Williams would have made his entire fantasy week if it wasn't for the fact that he fumbled literally on the 1 yard line. Of course, DeMarcus Lawrence made an incredible swim move onto the inside of that, that tight end, washed everyone down, took on the fullback, and on the same play, taking on 3 singular blocks, still made Jamaal Williams fumble. Jamaal Williams just jumps, he gets over the end zone, he scores, he puts up 12 fantasy points. But either way, even with DeAndre Swift potentially coming back this week, I'm expecting Jamaal Williams to get himself a fair share of touches, probably 10 plus, and with that, could end up seeing a touchdown and being fantasy relevant. Moving on to Michael Carter. I do believe that going into this week, Michael Carter will probably still be the primary back as he knows the offense more. And as we progress, we may see James Robinson take over. But as of right now, Michael Carter, in my opinion, will be the primary back for this week. As of thus far in his career, when he's been given 13 or more touches in a singular game, he's averaging about 13.36 half PPR fantasy points per game. Opportunity leads to success in fantasy football. And when you take on the New England Patriots, who just got ran through by the Chicago Bears, who ran for 205 total rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns between the contributions of Fields, Herbert, and Montgomery, I think there's a very good chance that we see Michael Carter with a pretty decent game this week with the opportunities given to him. Moving on to Khalil Herbert. Speaking of the Bears, Khalil Herbert, like I mentioned, is probably going to be the number 3 running option within this offense behind Montgomery and Fields. The fact that he didn't see a rushing attempt until 5 minutes and 33 seconds left in the second quarter leads me to believe that he is going to be a guy that is used sparingly and only in specific game scripts. This upcoming week against Dallas, of course, when in fact the running game kind of falls apart with Montgomery, he will get enough opportunities. And when he does, whether it is on the ground or through the air, he'll be a relevant enough RB3 option to be a potential flex play for those of you who are in desperate need. Moving on, James Robinson. Like I mentioned earlier, he's not going to be, the immediate impact starter. And quite frankly, he can't replace Breece Hall. Michael Carter or him are not going to be of the talent of Breece Hall. We know this. But they're going to try, and they're going to give him attempts. And whether he finds the end zone is probably the biggest difference maker, because if you give him 10 rushing attempts and he gets himself 40 yards, that is nothing for us. We need him to find the end zone. We need him to be a part of the receiving game. And quite frankly, the receiving game hasn't really been there for running backs for the Jets since Joe Flacco has been, pretty much benched for Zach Wilson's return. So as of right now, a little bit skeptical on his overall contribution to this offense going forward, but luckily they play against New England, which we saw most recently really struggle against stopping the run. Moving on to Melvin Gordon. I compare this backfield, considering that we have Mike Boone now injured, Melvin Gordon, Latavius Murray, and Marlon Mack. These 3 running backs are pretty much the movie Red. I don't know if you guys have seen that movie with Bruce Willis, Morgan Freeman. It's just a bunch of older actors being like action stars to an extent. That's what I expect to see here. It's a bunch of running backs that are severely past their primes, Marlon Mack, Melvin Gordon, Latavius Murray, that still have some gas left in the tank, that are going to be some amalgamation of a backfield that, quite frankly, may not find much success, especially considering they're traveling across the world to go play in Europe. All right, moving on, let's talk about our final option. It is Kareem Hunt. You may have not seen Kareem Hunt earlier on because I expect him to be traded before the November 1st deadline. The November 1st deadline is Tuesday. They play a Monday night game against the Cincinnati Bengals. If he's traded before then, don't be surprised. That is why I'm skeptical. If he's not traded before then of course, I'll go ahead and rank him by Sunday morning to keep you guys up to date. Let's go ahead, show you guys the final image for today's video, the 25 through 36 rankings for the running back position going into week 8 at a half PPR scoring format. Thank you everybody for watching. If you have not yet already and you enjoyed today's content, be sure to click the like button. Of course, subscribe if you have not yet already and help us get to our goal of 80,000 subscribers. Thank you once again for supporting the channel, guys. Again, be sure to go ahead, check out Prize Picks if you want to continue to play daily fantasy at your fingertips. Again, whether we're talking some of the potential picks like, Josh Jacobs, more than 80.5 rushing yards. I think that's a pretty achievable number for him going into this upcoming weekend's matchup based on what he has done as of late. Either way, go ahead and check that out. Use promo code Andrew today. And until tomorrow, I'll see you guys. Peace.